The restaurant fell silent when the billionaire snapped his fingers and demanded every dish be described in perfect Arabic for his blind mother. It was a test, a performance of power meant to humiliate. But the young waitress noticed what he did not, the tremor in his mother's hands, the isolation carved into her shoulders. And when she knelt beside the woman and began to speak, what she described was not food, but forgotten joy. The old woman wept, not from cruelty, but because after 3 years of darkness, someone finally made her feel truly seen. That woman was Fatima Hassan, 68 years old and blind for 3 years. She had once been a vibrant presence, a mother who cooked elaborate feasts and laughed easily. But when her sight faded, so did her world. She stopped leaving the house, stopped calling friends. Her son Khalid, a man whose fortune could buy anything except his mother's happiness, had grown impatient with her withdrawal. He thought taking her to the city's most exclusive restaurant would prove his devotion. He never realized his own harshness was another wall she had learned to endure. The waitress was Layla, a 24-year-old immigrant who understood invisibility better than most. She had served countless wealthy patrons who treated her like furniture, but in Fatima's trembling hands and downcast eyes, she recognized a different kind of erasure. What happened next was not just an act of service. It was a reckoning, and it would force an entire family to confront truths they had buried for decades. Fatima Hassan had not always lived in the dark. For 65 years, her world had been drenched in color and light. She was the kind of mother who could identify every spice in a bustling souk by scent alone, who decorated her home with fabrics so vibrant that neighbors would stop to admire them through open windows. Her kitchen in Abu Dhabi was legendary. On Fridays, the entire extended family would gather, sometimes 30 people crowding into her modest home, drawn by the aroma of lamb slow-cooked with cardamom and the saffron rice that only she could perfect. She moved through those rooms like a conductor, her hands knowing exactly where every pot and pan rested, her laughter filling every corner. That was before the diagnosis. It started with a slight blurring at the edges of her vision, something she dismissed as fatigue. But within 6 months, the world began to dissolve. Doctors used words like macular degeneration, terms that sounded clinical and distant while her reality crumbled. By her 66th birthday, she could no longer read the cards her grandchildren gave her. By 67, she needed help navigating her own hallway. The woman who had once commanded a kitchen with effortless precision now sat in a chair by the window, listening to the sounds of a life she could no longer see. Her husband had passed years earlier. Her daughters lived in other countries. Only Khalid, her youngest, remained in the same city. And Khalid was always busy. He was not cruel by nature. Those who knew him as a young man remembered a boy who would sit at his mother's feet while she cooked, asking endless questions about the recipes she had learned from her own grandmother. But the demands of building an empire had reshaped him. Al Rashid Holdings had started as a small import business and grown into a conglomerate spanning energy, real estate, and logistics across 3 continents. Khalid now employed over 12,000 people. His days were consumed by board meetings, investor calls, and the relentless pressure of managing assets worth more than the GDP of several small nations. He loved his mother deeply, but love, without time and presence, becomes an abstraction. He sent gifts on her birthday. He paid for the finest in-home care. He even visited once a month, sitting in her living room while checking his phone, speaking to her in the same clipped tone he used with underperforming executives. He did not notice that she had stopped cooking entirely, that the framed photographs on her walls were gathering dust because she could no longer see them to clean them, that her laughter had vanished. 3 years passed. Fatima's world shrank to the dimensions of her apartment. The caregivers were kind but rotated frequently, strangers who fed her meals she could not see and described television programs she could not follow. Her friends stopped calling, not out of cruelty, but because Fatima had stopped answering. What was there to say? That she spent her days counting the hours until sleep, that she sometimes forgot whether it was morning or night. Depression had settled over her like a heavy blanket, muffling everything except the persistent ache of isolation. She was alive, but she had stopped living. And Khalid, in his frantic pursuit of more wealth, had failed to notice the woman who had once been the center of his universe was disappearing. It was Layla who understood. She was only 24, a refugee from Syria who had arrived in Dubai 3 years earlier with nothing but a high school diploma and a determination to survive. The war had taken her home, her father, and 2 of her brothers. She had crossed borders with her mother and younger sister, spending 18 months in a camp in Jordan before a resettlement program brought them to the Emirates. Now she worked 60-hour weeks at Al Noor, one of Dubai's most exclusive restaurants, a place where a single meal could cost more than her monthly rent. She was invisible there, just as Fatima felt invisible in her own life. The wealthy patrons rarely looked at her. The chefs barked orders. Management counted minutes and tracked tips, but Layla had learned in the camps to see what others overlooked. She noticed the way certain customers flinched when their companions raised their voices. She noticed who ate alone and who was merely waiting. She noticed loneliness. It was a language she spoke fluently. The confrontation happened on a Thursday evening in early December. Khalid had decided, with the best of intentions, that his mother's 68th birthday demanded an extraordinary gesture. He would take her to Al Noor, the very pinnacle of Dubai's dining scene. He would show her and perhaps himself that he still cared. A private car was arranged. A corner table was reserved, offering privacy without isolation. Fatima had protested weakly, her voice thin with disuse. She had not been to a restaurant since losing her sight. The thought of navigating an unfamiliar space, surrounded by strangers who might stare, filled her with dread. But Khalid insisted. And so she found herself seated at a table draped in white linen, her hands folded in her lap, her unseeing eyes fixed somewhere in the middle distance. The menu arrived, printed on heavy paper with elegant script that she could not read. Khalid ordered quickly, scanning the options with the efficiency of a man who consumed information for a living. He did not ask his mother what she wanted. Instead, he summoned the nearest waitress with an imperious gesture, the same gesture he used to summon junior analysts to his conference room. That waitress was Layla. She approached the table with her usual quiet professionalism, notepad ready, her expression neutral. But the moment she saw Fatima, something shifted. She noticed the slight tremor in the older woman's hands. She noticed the way Fatima's head tilted, not toward her son, but toward the distant sounds of the kitchen, as if straining to orient herself in a world without landmarks. And she noticed the deep, bone-weary sadness etched into every line of the woman's face. Khalid did not notice any of this. He looked up at Layla and spoke in Arabic, his tone sharp and dismissive. "My mother is blind. I want you to describe every single dish on this menu to her in perfect Arabic. Not the English translations, not the simplified versions, the real descriptions. Do you understand?" He spoke as if issuing a challenge, as if daring the staff to prove themselves worthy of his patronage. The other diners fell silent. Fatima's shoulders tensed, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She had spent 3 years learning to accept the darkness, but she had never learned to accept being treated as a burden, as a problem to be solved with demands and impatience. She opened her mouth to protest, to tell her son to stop, but the words would not come. They had not come for years. Layla looked at Khalid, then at Fatima. She could have simply recited the menu as ordered. She could have delivered the standard descriptions, the list of ingredients and preparations, the polite recitation of a well-trained server. It would have satisfied his demand and allowed her to retreat to the safety of the kitchen, where she could resume her invisibility. But something in the older woman's expression stopped her. It was the look of someone who had been unseen for so long that she had begun to doubt her own existence, and Layla knew that look. She had worn it herself in the refugee camp when the world had passed her by without a glance. She set down her notepad. She pulled a chair to the table and sat down, not as a servant but as an equal, and she began to speak, not about food, about memory. About color and texture, and the things that cannot be captured on a menu. What happened next would change everything. But first, she had to break the silence that had imprisoned Fatima for 3 long years. Layla did not reach for the menu. Instead, she knelt beside Fatima's chair, bringing herself to eye level with the older woman, close enough to see the tears that had begun to gather in her unseeing eyes. The restaurant had gone quiet, the other diners pretending not to watch while straining to hear every word. Khalid sat rigid in his seat, his expression shifting from impatience to confusion. This was not what he had demanded. He had asked for a recitation, a performance of competence, but what Layla began to describe was something else entirely. "Saffron," she said softly, her voice carrying only to Fatima's ears. "Do you remember the color of saffron, madam? It is the gold of a winter sunset, the moment before the sun disappears and the whole sky turns to fire. When you were young, perhaps your mother would soak the threads in warm water, and the water would become like liquid amber, and the whole kitchen would smell of honey and earth and something ancient. That is the first dish, rice infused with saffron, the color of memory itself." Fatima's hands stopped trembling. Her head tilted slightly, no longer toward the distant kitchen, but toward Layla's voice, as if she were watching a film made entirely of sound. And in her mind, the film was playing. She could see her mother's kitchen in the old house in Abu Dhabi, the one with the blue tiles and the window that faced the sea. She could see the saffron threads floating in the warm water, spreading their golden color like ink in slow motion. She had not seen that image for 3 years. But now it was there, vivid and complete, painted by the words of a stranger who had somehow known exactly what to say. Layla continued, moving through the menu dish by dish, but she described nothing in terms of ingredients. She described the lamb not as braised and seasoned, but as the warmth of your mother's embrace when you were small and afraid, tender enough to fall apart at the touch, the kind of comfort that makes you close your eyes and exhale. She described the rosewater dessert not as a confection, but as your grandmother's garden in spring, when the first blooms opened and the air was so thick with sweetness that you wanted to bottle it and wear it like perfume. She described the mint tea as the taste of forgiveness, cool and sharp and cleansing, the thing you drink after a long cry when you are finally ready to begin again. The restaurant had fallen completely silent now. Other servers had stopped moving between tables. The maitre d' stood frozen near the entrance. Even the chefs, who could not possibly have heard Layla's quiet words, had somehow sensed that something extraordinary was happening and were peering through the small window that separated the kitchen from the dining room. But no one interrupted. No one dared, because Fatima was weeping, not the quiet tears of embarrassment or shame, the kind she had shed in private for 3 years. These were different. These were the tears of someone who had been trapped in a dark room and had suddenly felt a door swing open. Her shoulders shook. Her hands reached out blindly, finding Layla's and gripping them with desperate strength. And then she spoke, her voice cracked and raw from years of silence. "How do you know?" Fatima whispered. "How do you know what my mother's kitchen looked like, what my grandmother's garden smelled like? You do not know me, you have never seen me before tonight. And yet you have described the inside of my own memories. How is this possible?" Layla squeezed the old woman's hands gently. "Because I have been invisible too," she said. "When people do not see you, you learn to see everything. You learn to notice the small details that tell the whole story. I looked at you, madam, and I saw a woman who was not blind but was being blinded, not by her eyes, by loneliness." The silence that followed was so complete that the soft hum of the ventilation system seemed suddenly loud. Fatima's mouth opened, but no words came. She was looking at Layla with an expression that was not quite wonder and not quite recognition. It was the look of someone who had been drowning and had finally, unexpectedly, felt solid ground beneath their feet. Khalid sat frozen in his chair. His face had gone pale, the confidence drained away. He had brought his mother to this restaurant to prove something, to prove that he was a good son, to prove that his wealth could provide anything she needed. But in the space of 5 minutes, a waitress had done what all his money and all his grand gestures had failed to do. She had reached his mother, she had made her feel seen, and he had only made her feel like a burden. He cleared his throat, trying to reassert control. "That is enough," he said, his voice louder than necessary. "You have made your point. Now please bring the food we ordered." But Fatima raised her hand, a gesture so firm and commanding that it silenced her son instantly. It was the hand of the woman she used to be, the woman who had commanded a kitchen full of family and friends, the woman who had not been seen or heard for 3 long years. "No," she said, "let her continue. For the first time since I lost my sight, I can see." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Khalid stared at his mother, seeing her truly for what might have been the first time in years. He saw the deep lines around her mouth, the hollows beneath her cheekbones, the way her body had shrunk into itself. He saw the evidence of her suffering, evidence that he had somehow managed to overlook during all his monthly visits. And he saw something else too. He saw the faintest flicker of light returning to her face, a light he had assumed was extinguished forever. Layla continued her descriptions, moving now beyond the menu. She described the tablecloth as clouds beneath your fingertips. She described the candle flame she knew Fatima could not see as a tiny sun, warm if you lean close enough. She described the music playing softly in the background as the sound of water running over smooth stones. And with each description, Fatima's posture straightened, her chin lifted. Her hands, which had been clenched tightly in her lap, relaxed and opened, palms up, as if she were receiving a gift. But here is what no one else in that restaurant knew. Here is what Layla had not told anyone. She was not merely describing things she imagined. She was describing things she had lost. 3 years earlier, when the bombs fell on her neighborhood in Homs, she had been trapped beneath rubble for 11 hours. Her father was already dead, killed by the initial blast. Her brothers were somewhere in the chaos, their fates unknown. And Layla lay in the darkness, unable to move, unable to see, listening to the sounds of a world collapsing around her. For 11 hours, she was completely blind. When she was finally pulled from the wreckage, her vision returned. But those 11 hours had changed her permanently. She had learned, in that terrible darkness, to construct entire worlds from sound and texture and memory. She had learned to see without eyes. And in the years since, she had used that skill to survive, to navigate the strange new cities where she had been deposited by fate. But she had never used it for anyone else. She had never thought of it as a gift, until tonight. The food arrived, and Fatima ate with an appetite that astonished her son. She savored each bite, identifying the flavors that Layla had described, her face alive with pleasure that bordered on joy. She asked questions. She made observations. She laughed, a sound that Khalid had not heard since before her diagnosis. And throughout the meal, Layla remained close, not as a server but as a companion, describing each new dish as it arrived, answering Fatima's questions with patience and warmth. Khalid watched in silence. He ate nothing. His mind was racing, trying to process what he was witnessing. He had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on specialists and treatments for his mother. He had hired the best caregivers money could find. He had bought her every device and aid that modern medicine could offer, and none of it had made a difference. None of it had brought her back to life. But this stranger, this young woman who earned less in a month than he spent on a single dinner, had done it with words. With nothing but words and the willingness to see what he had refused to see. When the meal ended and the plates were cleared, Fatima reached for Layla's hand once more. Her grip was strong now, the grip of a woman who had remembered her own strength. "What is your name?" she asked. "Layla," the young woman replied. "Layla," Fatima repeated, as if tasting the word. "In Arabic it means night, but you have brought light back into my darkness. How can I ever thank you?" Layla smiled, though Fatima could not see it. "You already have," she said, "by letting me use what I learned in my own darkness to help someone else. That is all the thanks I need." Khalid called for the bill, his voice subdued. He did not know what to say. He did not know how to process the transformation he had witnessed. He only knew that something fundamental had shifted, something he could not yet name. As he helped his mother to her feet, preparing to leave, she turned her head toward where she knew Layla was standing. "I will not forget this," Fatima said. "I will not forget you." And then they were gone, the private car whisking them back to the silent apartment where Fatima had spent 3 years in solitary confinement. But something was different now. The darkness was still there. It would always be there. But she carried with her a new understanding. She was not alone in it. Somewhere in the city, there was a young woman who understood, who had been in the darkness too. And that knowledge, that connection, was a kind of light that no doctor had ever prescribed and no medicine could replicate. But the story does not end here, because Khalid, sitting in the back of the car beside his transformed mother, was wrestling with emotions he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Guilt, yes, but also something else, a strange and unfamiliar sense of humility. For the first time in decades, he had been shown that his wealth was not the answer to every problem. And the person who had shown him was a refugee waitress who earned less than he spent on his morning coffee. He would not sleep that night. He would lie awake in his penthouse, surrounded by every luxury money could buy, and he would think about Layla, about what she had done. about what it meant. And by morning, he would make a decision that would change everything. A decision that would bring him back to the restaurant, not as a customer, but as a supplicant. A decision that would reveal truths about his own past that he had spent a lifetime avoiding. But before that decision, before the revelation that would shatter his understanding of his own family, there was one more moment that Fatima needed to experience. One more gift that Layla had to give. Because when Fatima returned to her apartment that night, she asked her caregiver to do something she had not asked in 3 years. She asked for her phone, and she dictated a message, her voice steady and sure. The message was not to her son, it was not to her daughters or her friends, it was to the restaurant, addressed to Layla. And what it said would set in motion a chain of events that no one could have predicted. Events that would expose long-buried secrets and force a reckoning that was decades overdue. Fatima's message was not short, it was not a simple thank you. It was a flood, a release of words she had been storing for years, dictated to her caregiver with a voice that grew stronger with each sentence. She spoke of her mother's kitchen, the one Layla had somehow described without ever seeing it. She spoke of the garden behind her grandmother's house, where she had played as a child, and where the roses bloomed so thickly that you could smell them from 3 streets away. She spoke of her husband, who had died 12 years earlier, and how she had never been able to describe to anyone the exact shade of his eyes, a warm brown like coffee with a single drop of milk. And she spoke of Khalid, her son, the boy who had once sat at her feet asking endless questions, and the man he had become, a man who looked at her with the same impatience he showed his employees. She poured it all out, every memory and every grief, and at the end she wrote, "You gave me back my sight, Layla, not with eyes but with words. I do not know why a stranger would give me such a gift, but I will spend whatever time I have left trying to repay it." The message arrived at Al Noor restaurant at 11:47 that night. The manager, a thin man named Rashid who prided himself on efficiency, read it 3 times, his hands trembling. He had seen the interaction earlier that evening, had watched Layla kneel beside the blind woman and speak in that strange, beautiful way. He had not intervened. He had sensed something sacred unfolding, something that had no place in the daily routine of table turns and tip percentages. Now, holding this message, he understood that the restaurant had been the stage for an event that was far from ordinary. He forwarded it to Layla, who was already home in her small apartment in Deira, preparing for another shift the next day. When Layla read the message, she wept, not the quiet tears of exhaustion she shed most nights, but deep, racking sobs that woke her younger sister, Amina, who shared the apartment. Amina rushed to her side, certain something terrible had happened, but Layla could not explain. She could only hold up her phone and cry because the words on the screen were not words. They were a mirror. They showed her something she had not realized she possessed. She had spent years believing she was nothing, a survivor who had lost everything and belonged nowhere. But Fatima's message told her something different. It told her that what she had learned in the darkness, in that rubble in Homs, was not a scar but a skill. It was a light she could give to others, and she had given it. The message did not stay private. Rashid, the restaurant manager, was so moved that he shared it with the restaurant's owner, who shared it with a journalist friend. Within 36 hours, a shortened version of the story appeared on a popular Dubai news website. The headline read, "Waitress's words restore blind woman's sight, not medically, but miraculously." The article went viral. It was shared across Arabic language social media, then translated into English, French, and Hindi. News outlets from around the world picked it up. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know about the young Syrian refugee who had described saffron as the color of memory, and the wealthy blind woman who had wept because someone finally made her feel seen. The attention was overwhelming. Layla arrived at work to find cameras outside the restaurant. Reporters shouted questions. Diners who had booked tables months in advance were now asking to be seated in her section, hoping to witness the magic themselves. But Layla was not comfortable with fame. She had survived by being invisible. To be thrust into the spotlight felt like standing naked in a storm. She wanted only to do her job, to send money to her mother and sister, to live quietly. But the world would not let her. Khalid watched the frenzy unfold from the sterile silence of his corner office. The same office where 6 months earlier, the original story's billionaire had offered Fatima a job. Now Khalid was that billionaire, and he too felt a strange compulsion building inside him. He had not slept the night after the dinner. He had replayed Layla's words over and over, comparing them to his own harsh demand that she describe every dish in perfect Arabic. He had seen his mother come alive, and he had seen the cost of his own neglect in stark, undeniable terms. The guilt was overwhelming, but beneath the guilt something else was stirring, a memory, a name. He called David Chen, his assistant, into the office. David was young and efficient, a man who could find anything about anyone. Khalid gave him a single instruction: "I want to know everything about Layla, her background, her family, her journey from Syria, leave nothing out." David hesitated. "Sir, after the news coverage, her file is already being compiled by several outlets." "We could simply—" "I want more than what the news has," Khalid interrupted. "I want the truth, all of it." David nodded and left. Khalid turned to the window, watching the city below. He was not sure what he expected to find. Perhaps he only wanted to understand the woman who had done what he could not. Perhaps he wanted to find a way to repay her, but what he would discover was something he could never have anticipated. The background report arrived 3 days later. It was thorough, as David's work always was. Layla Sabag, age 24, born in Homs, Syria. Father, Yusuf Sabag, deceased. Mother, Maryam, residing in Jordan with Layla's younger sister. 2 brothers, both deceased, killed in the same bombing that had claimed their father. The family had fled to Jordan in 2016, spending 18 months in the Zaatari refugee camp before being granted resettlement in the Emirates. Layla had worked in a textile factory in Jordan, then as a cleaner in Dubai before finding the position at Al Noor. Her record was spotless, her reputation was pristine, but it was not the biographical details that made Khalid's blood run cold. It was the name of her father, Yusuf Sabag. Khalid had not heard that name in 16 years, but now it came roaring back, dragging with it a history he had spent a lifetime trying to bury. In 2007, when Al Rashid Holdings was still a relatively small construction and logistics firm, Khalid had secured a contract to build a warehouse complex on the outskirts of Aleppo. The project was part of a larger expansion into Syria, a market he believed held enormous potential. The workforce was largely local, men desperate for any employment in a country already showing signs of the unrest that would later erupt into war. Yusuf Sabag had been one of those men. He was a foreman, a skilled builder who had worked on dozens of projects across Syria. He was also the father of 4 children, including a daughter named Layla who was 8 years old at the time. The accident happened in early 2008. A section of scaffolding collapsed. 2 workers were killed. Yusuf Sabag was one of them. The investigation, conducted by Khalid's company with minimal external oversight, concluded that the collapse was due to improper assembly by the workers themselves. The company was cleared of liability. The families received a small settlement, enough to cover funeral costs and little more. Khalid had signed the paperwork himself, barely glancing at the names. It was one of hundreds of such documents that crossed his desk in those years. He had not thought about it since. But now, sitting in his office with the report in his hands, he could think of nothing else. The woman who had saved his mother, who had reached into Fatima's darkness and pulled her back into the light, was the daughter of a man whose death Khalid's company had effectively dismissed as incompetence. A man whose family had been left with almost nothing. A man whose daughter had grown up in a war zone, lost her brothers, and fled across borders to survive. And now that daughter was scrubbing dishes and serving meals to people who had never known a day of true hardship. Khalid felt the walls of his carefully constructed reality beginning to crack. He had always believed he was a good man. He had built an empire from nothing, provided for his family, and donated millions to charity. But sitting here, confronted by the living consequence of his indifference, he saw himself clearly for the first time. He had not merely failed his mother. He had failed people he had never even known existed, people whose lives had been shattered by decisions he made without a second thought. And the woman who had shown him grace, who had taught him what compassion truly looked like, was one of the people he had wronged. He closed the report and sat in silence for a long time, His wealth, his power, his reputation, all of it suddenly felt like dust. There was only one thing he could do. He had to find Layla. He had to tell her the truth. He did not know how she would react. He did not know if she would forgive him, but he knew that silence was no longer an option. The reckoning his mother had mentioned in her message was coming, and he was the one who would have to face it. Layla learned the truth on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 days after Khalid's discovery. She had been approached by a reporter who was doing a follow-up story, a piece about her life before Dubai. The reporter had done extensive research, digging into old records from Syria. She had discovered the connection between Yusuf Sabag and Al Rashid Holdings. She had found the settlement documents, the investigation report, the signatures. When she showed them to Layla, the young woman's world tilted on its axis. She stared at the papers, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes were seeing. Her father had died in an accident, she had always been told. It was the war, it was fate. It was nobody's fault, but these documents suggested something else. They suggested negligence, they suggested a cover-up, and the name of the man who had signed off on the settlement, the man who had ensured the company faced no consequences, was Khalid al-Rashid, the son of the woman she had just helped, the man who had barked at her in the restaurant, demanding perfect Arabic as if she were a machine he had paid to perform. Layla's hands began to shake. The grief she had carried for years, the grief for her father and her brothers, had always been a private thing, a wound she kept hidden. But now it was being torn open in the most public way imaginable. And the person responsible for that grief, at least in part, was the same person who now dominated the news as a generous philanthropist, a man who had announced a $100 million donation for displaced children. The irony was so cruel that she could barely breathe. She had been invisible to him in the restaurant, just as her father had been invisible to him 16 years ago. Invisible until she had done something that forced him to see. Khalid had planned to approach Layla gently, to offer her a position at his foundation, and to find a way to disclose the connection with care. But he had waited too long. The reporter's story broke before he could act. The headline was devastating. Hero waitress's father died in billionaire benefactor's construction disaster. The article laid out the entire history, from the warehouse project in Aleppo to the viral restaurant encounter. It painted Khalid as a man whose wealth was built on the backs of the forgotten, a hypocrite who had been publicly humbled by a woman whose family he had destroyed. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Khalid's company issued denials. His board demanded a damage control strategy. Protesters gathered outside his office building. The $100 million donation was suddenly in jeopardy, with partner organizations distancing themselves from the scandal. And Layla, overwhelmed and betrayed, retreated into a silence that reminded Khalid of his mother's isolation. She stopped answering her phone. She stopped going to work. She hid in her apartment, trying to understand how a single act of kindness could have led to this. But the story was not over, because Fatima, sitting in her apartment with the television droning in the background, heard the news. And when she understood what had happened, she did not retreat. She did not defend her son. Instead, she called for her caregiver and dictated another message. This one was not to Layla, it was to Khalid alone. "You will come to me," she said. "You will bring Layla if she is willing, and we will all sit together in the same room. What your money has broken, you cannot repair with more money, but you can repair it with truth, and you will, or you will lose everything that matters." Khalid received the message and wept. He had spent his life believing his mother was fragile, diminished by her blindness. But in this moment, her voice was the strongest he had ever heard, and he knew that the reckoning she demanded was the only path forward. He would have to face Layla. He would have to account for the past, not as a billionaire but as a man. And what that confrontation would reveal would change all of them, Fatima, Layla, and Khalid, in ways none of them could yet foresee. Khalid did not call ahead. He did not send his assistant or a driver. He went himself to Layla's apartment in Deira, a cramped building with peeling paint and an elevator that groaned with every floor. He wore no tie. His usual armor of wealth and status was stripped away, and what remained was just a 58-year-old man with stooped shoulders and red-rimmed eyes. He knocked softly, and when no one answered, he knocked again. He heard footsteps inside, a muffled conversation. Then the door opened a crack, and he saw Layla's face, pale and wary, her eyes swollen from crying. She tried to close the door, but he spoke before she could. "Please, I'm not here to defend myself. I'm not here to offer you money. I am here because my mother asked me to come, and because I owe you the truth, all of it, if you will listen." For a long moment, Layla said nothing. She looked at him, this man whose name had been seared into her memory for 2 days as the author of her family's destruction. She saw the exhaustion in his face, the absence of the arrogance she remembered from the restaurant. She saw something else too, something that looked like the beginning of remorse. And because she had learned to see what others missed, she opened the door. The drive to Fatima's apartment was silent. Khalid's driver navigated the city while the 2 passengers sat on opposite sides of the back seat, staring out separate windows. Layla wondered what she was doing. She had every reason to hate this man, but hatred had never been her nature. She had survived war and displacement by clinging to the belief that people were more than their worst moments. Now she was being asked to test that belief in the most personal way possible. Fatima was waiting in her living room, seated in her favorite chair by the window, the one that faced the sea she could no longer see. She heard the door open, heard the footsteps, and she knew without being told that both of them had come. Her caregiver helped her to her feet, and she stood, her hands extended, her blind eyes fixed on the space where she knew they would be. "Come," she said, "sit with me. All of us have been lost in the dark. It is time we found our way out together." They sat, Fatima in her chair, Khalid on the sofa, Layla in a straight-backed chair she had pulled close to the older woman. The afternoon light filtered through the curtains, casting soft shadows that only Layla and Khalid could see. And then, in the silence of that room, the reckoning began. Khalid spoke first. His voice was hoarse, the voice of a man who had not slept. He told Layla everything. He told her about the project in Aleppo, the warehouse that was supposed to be a symbol of his company's expansion. He told her about the scaffolding collapse, the 2 workers who died, the investigation that was too hasty and too convenient. He told her that he could not say with certainty whether the company was at fault, and that was precisely the problem. He had not wanted to know. He had signed the settlement papers without looking at the names, because looking would have meant confronting the possibility that his ambition had cost innocent men their lives. He had chosen ignorance, and ignorance was a form of guilt. "I did not kill your father," Khalid said, his voice cracking, "but I allowed his death to be forgotten. I allowed your family to be left with nothing while I built an empire. And when you knelt beside my mother and gave her back her memories, you did it with a grace I have never possessed. You are the daughter of a man I failed, and you showed my mother more kindness than I have shown anyone in years. I do not expect your forgiveness. I'm not sure I deserve it, but I needed you to hear the truth from my own mouth." Layla sat motionless. Her hands were clasped in her lap, her knuckles white. She had imagined this moment 100 times in the past 48 hours, rehearsing the accusations she would hurl, the anger she would unleash. But now, faced with Khalid's brokenness, the anger felt like a fire that had already burned itself out. What remained was grief. Grief for her father, whose laugh she could no longer quite remember. Grief for her brothers, who would never grow old. Grief for herself, the girl who had been buried under rubble and emerged into a world that had taken everything from her. "I was 8 years old," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "When they told us he was gone, my mother collapsed. My brothers screamed. I did not understand. I kept waiting for him to come home. For months, every time I heard footsteps outside the door, I thought it was him. And then the war came, and there were other footsteps to fear, other losses to endure. I stopped waiting, I stopped hopping, I became invisible." She looked up at Khalid and there were tears on her cheeks. "You were not the only one who ignored us. The whole world ignored us. But you were the one whose signature was on the paper that said my father's life was worth nothing. And then you came into my restaurant and spoke to me as if I were nothing too. Do you understand what that felt like?" Khalid could not answer. He could only nod, his own tears falling freely. The billionaire who had commanded boardrooms and negotiated billion-dollar deals was utterly undone, stripped of every pretense. Fatima, who had been listening in silence, reached out and found Layla's hand. Her grip was warm and steady. "Child," Fatima said, "I have spent 3 years believing my life was over. I thought blindness was a punishment, a slow death. But you showed me that I was wrong. You showed me that the world is still there, waiting to be seen in other ways. And you did that despite everything you had suffered. You did that because you refused to let the darkness win. My son has done terrible things, not out of malice, but out of indifference. That is its own kind of sin. But he is here now. He is listening. He is trying to be the man I raised him to be. Can you find it in your heart to let him try? Layla looked at Fatima, then at Khalid. She thought of her father, Yusuf, who had been a gentle man, a man who believed in second chances. She thought of her mother, still living in a camp in Jordan, still waiting for a miracle that never came. She thought of herself, the girl who had survived 11 hours under rubble and emerged determined to find light in the darkness. And she made a choice. I will not forgive you, she said to Khalid, and his face crumpled. Not yet. Forgiveness is not something you can demand. It must be earned over years through actions and not words. But I will not hate you either. Hatred is a weight I have carried too long. I am putting it down. What you do with that is your own choice. Khalid bowed his head. I will earn it, he said. I will spend the rest of my life earning it. Not just from you, but from all the workers whose lives I treated as numbers on a ledger. I will change my company. I will create safety standards and independent oversight. I will establish a fund in your father's name, a fund that supports the families of workers who are injured or killed, and I will make sure that his name is remembered. Layla was silent for a moment, then she nodded slowly. That would be a beginning, she said, but there is one more thing you must do. You must call my mother. You must tell her what you have told me. She has carried this grief longer than anyone. She deserves to hear your voice. The call was made that very afternoon. Layla dialed the number, and Khalid took the phone with trembling hands. When Mariam Sabag answered from her small room in the Jordanian camp, her voice frail with age and hardship, Khalid spoke to her in Arabic, the language she understood best. He told her who he was. He told her what he had done. He apologized, not with legal language or corporate carefulness, but with the raw honesty of a man who had finally confronted his own soul. And when Mariam wept, it was not only from sorrow, it was from relief. Someone had finally acknowledged her husband's death. Someone had finally said his name. In the weeks that followed, the story continued to ripple outward. Khalid kept his promises. He overhauled his company's safety protocols, hiring an independent international firm to inspect every Al Rashid construction site. He established the Yusuf Sabag Memorial Fund, endowed with $50 million, dedicated to supporting the families of workers killed or injured on construction projects across the Middle East. He flew to Jordan and met Mariam in person, and he brought with him documentation that would allow her and her remaining daughter to resettle in the Emirates with full support. Layla returned to work at Al Noor, but she was no longer invisible. The restaurant had become a destination, but she asked the management to shield her from the attention. She wanted only to serve, to use her gift of seeing when others did not. She continued to visit Fatima every Friday, and the two women would sit together, Fatima describing the memories Layla had helped unlock, and Layla learning to describe the world in ways that made the blind woman laugh and weep and feel alive. And Fatima herself was transformed. She did not regain her sight, but she regained something far more important, her purpose. She began attending events again, not as a reluctant obligation, but as a woman with something to offer. She spoke at a conference on aging and disability, sharing her story of isolation and reconnection. She appeared on a television program, seated beside Layla, and together they described the power of being truly seen. She reconnected with her daughters, her friends, the world she had abandoned. But here is the detail that no one saw coming. It emerged 3 months after the confrontation, during a routine review of the old Aleppo project files. Khalid had ordered a full investigation, determined to understand exactly what had happened. And what the investigators discovered was not what anyone expected. The scaffolding that collapsed had not been assembled improperly by the workers. It had been deliberately sabotaged by a rival contractor who wanted to halt the project. The workers, including Yusuf Sabag, were innocent. The accident was not negligence, it was a crime, and the man who had orchestrated it had died years later, his crimes never discovered. When Khalid learned this, he wept again, not from relief, but from the crushing weight of what might have been. If he had investigated properly 16 years ago, the truth would have come out. Yusuf would have been exonerated. His family would have received justice. But he had chosen convenience over truth, and that choice had cost a family everything. He told Layla immediately, sharing every document, and Layla, after reading the report, looked at Khalid with an expression that was neither anger nor forgiveness, but something more complex. "My father was a good man," she said. "He did nothing wrong, and now the world knows that. That matters to me, but what matters more is that you cared enough to find out. That you did not run away from the truth when you could have. That more than anything tells me you have changed." And so ends the story of a blind mother, a refugee waitress, and a billionaire son. It is a story about sight and blindness, about memory and loss, about the invisible threads that connect strangers across chasms of wealth and circumstance. It is a reminder that heroism wears no uniform, that dignity can be restored by a single act of attention, and that the truth, no matter how long buried, can still set people free. But the truly remarkable part of this story is what happened next. Because Layla's gift, the gift she discovered in the rubble of a Syrian war zone, did not stop with one woman. It became a movement. And the wave she started would reach thousands of others who, like Fatima, had been forgotten by a world that was too busy to see. It began with a single meal, a single moment of attention. But Layla had unlocked something far larger than one woman's forgotten memories. Her gift was not magic. It was the simple, radical act of truly seeing another human being. When Fatima's story spread, something remarkable happened. Messages poured in from strangers across the world, elderly people who felt invisible, refugees living in the margins, sons and daughters who recognized their own impatience in Khalid's harshness. They all wanted the same thing: to be seen, to be heard, to matter. Layla's inbox overflowed. She could not answer everyone, but she read every message. And she began to realize that what she had done in that restaurant, kneeling beside a trembling stranger, could be taught. Not as a technique, but as a posture. So with the foundation's support, she launched a program called The Art of Seeing. It trained hospitality workers, caregivers, and anyone willing to learn how to serve people with visual impairments, not with pity, but with dignity. How to describe a plate of food as a memory. How to speak to someone who cannot see you as if they are fully present, fully alive. The program spread to hotels, hospitals, and refugee centers across the region. It was not charity, it was a quiet revolution in human decency. Khalid's life also transformed, but in a quieter way. He stepped back from daily operations, ceding control to a younger leadership team. He spent his time in Jordan, where Mariam Sabag and her daughter had been resettled into a comfortable home. He visited every week. He learned to cook from Mariam, the same dishes Layla had described to his mother. And slowly, over many months, a fragile friendship grew between them. Not a transaction, but a connection. He could never undo what happened, but he could build something new from the wreckage. And in the process, he rediscovered the boy who had once sat at his mother's feet, asking endless questions, hungry not for power, but for understanding. As for Fatima, she lived another 4 years after that night at the restaurant. She continued to speak publicly, sharing her story in schools and community centers. She learned to use a screen reader and dictated letters to people who wrote to her from across the globe. When she finally passed, at the age of 72, her apartment was filled with flowers sent by hundreds of strangers who had been touched by her resilience. At her funeral, Layla stood and spoke about their first meeting. "She taught me that blindness is not a lack," Layla said. "It is simply a different way of seeing, and if we are brave enough to enter someone else's darkness, we might discover our own light there." The Yusuf Sabag Memorial Fund continues to operate today. It has supported over 1,000 families in 16 countries. Every year, on the anniversary of Yusuf's death, Layla and Khalid visit the school built in his name in northern Jordan. It is filled with children who were displaced, who have lost so much, but who are learning to read and write and dream. They know the story of a man who died unfairly and whose name now gives life to futures he could never have imagined. Think about that. A blind woman, a refugee waitress, a billionaire son, 3 people trapped in their own darkness, colliding in a single moment. And from that collision came not anger or revenge, but transformation. The question this story asks is the same one it asks of each of us. Who have you stopped seeing? Who in your life has become invisible? What would happen if you knelt down, looked closely, and truly paid attention? If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Every subscription helps us bring you more real stories of courage, connection, and the human capacity to change. Share this video with someone who needs to know that they are seen. And tell us in the comments, when was the last time someone truly saw you? Thank you for watching. And remember, in a world that often rushes past, the greatest gift you can give is your attention.